Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Facebook Live. And it's Aloha from Hawaii again. Every 6 months I come out here to do our Huna intensives, March and September. And so I thought, well, since I can do a Facebook Live from the beach, that's exactly what I'd do. The sun is just coming up. We've got the ocean behind us, so a really fantastic setting. And very, very quiet on the beach this morning. Just about 4 or 5 of my students I've seen as I've been walking down here. So this evening I thought I'd do a slightly different topic. It's not really a topic that's related to NLP or hypnosis or timeline therapy. It is something that we talk about a lot on our Huna trainings, and that is the idea of boundaries and how do we go about setting up personal boundaries, and how do we go about managing those boundaries once we've set them up. Because if we look at the things that prevent us from being able to create what we want in our life, then we have a number of things. Some of those we've already talked about. Negative emotions, anger, sadness, fear, hurt, guilt, limiting beliefs or limiting decisions, like I'm not good enough, I can't have the kind of money that I want. And also the thing that would prevent us from being able to create what we wanted would also be our lack of boundaries or our inability to manage boundaries. So let me explain what a boundary is. So a boundary is something which you set up around yourself or for yourself, which communicates to other people, these are the things which are okay with me, and the things that you want to have included in your boundary, and the things that are outside of that boundary. And we want to have those in our personal relationships, in our family, in our work, in our career, in our business. Now, quite often what I find when I'm working with clients is that they experience people running over their boundaries because they haven't effectively communicated to people what their boundaries are. And what in general people tend to do is they tend to assume that everybody else's boundaries are the same as theirs, and they're not. And when somebody violates our boundaries, runs over our boundaries, does something around us that we're not okay about, then our unconscious mind tells us about that by creating a negative emotion. We might get angry about somebody doing something. We might get sad about somebody doing something. It might scare us. We might be afraid. We might feel hurt, or we might feel guilty if we violate one of our own personal boundaries. So really what you need to start deciding is what is okay for you. If somebody wants to be in your space, for want of a better word, what do they need to do to be in that space? But what are the things that aren't okay for you in that space? And being very specific and very clear about that in the way that we communicate it to people. Now, quite often, people put down boundaries, and they put down boundaries whilst they're feeling a negative emotion. So somebody violates a boundary, they're feeling angry about it, and they attempt to put down the boundary with the person whilst they're still angry, or they're still sad, or they're still afraid, or they're still feeling hurt. When we put down a boundary with a negative emotion, then because emotions are attractive in nature, if we put down a boundary whilst we're angry, then what we'll do is actually attract people to violate that boundary and make us angry to prove that if people do that around us, we'll be angry. So the correct state, the most appropriate state to be in when you set up a boundary is to be in an emotionally flat state, if not actually a positive state. Yeah. So, one of the things really would be to be able to put down your boundary in a very matter-of-fact way. Almost like if somebody would ask you the time, you'd probably just go 10 to 7. And it's just a fact. There's no emotion around it. So that's an important thing. And to put down boundaries in a towards way, as in these are the things that when you do these, I'll be happy. When you do this, I won't be happy. So that then people can decide whether they want to be inside of your boundary or not. So a couple of things you could do this in employment. Let's have a conversation about how we can work together successfully, the things that I expect for us to work together successfully, and here's the things that would actually have us not be able to work together successfully. Relationships. Let's have a chat about what makes me happy and what makes me unhappy. So here's the things that, like, if we do this in my space, I'll be happy. If this happens in my space, I won't be happy. And communicating that to the other person. Now, when you put down a boundary with zero emotion in a very matter-of-fact way, or you put down a boundary with a positive emotion, the chances of then somebody testing that boundary are dramatically reduced. Though, if you think about it, if you put down a boundary with a 5-year-old, then what does that 5-year-old do? They tend to test the boundary to see if you really mean it. So the important thing, therefore, is to expect the boundary is just going to be down there and the people are going to respect it, though also being prepared with a strategy for what you do if somebody actually doesn't maintain your boundary, doesn't honor your boundary, and runs over that boundary. The important thing is to deal with it without negative emotion, because as soon as you feel angry or sad or afraid or hurt or guilty, then it's all going to go horribly wrong. So the thing, therefore, is to, take a breath, maybe do some work with yourself to release the negative emotion. Then here's the protocol or the strategy for managing boundaries. So the first thing you say to the person is, do you realize that we had an agreement? If they say no, then presupposition of NLP, meaningful communication is the response you get. Therefore, you didn't actually effectively communicate with the person that you had made an agreement. So you need to take responsibility for that. So explain how you'd made an agreement and they broke the agreement, and then say, would you like to remake the agreement? If they say yes, then we go through the process again. And the thing that we would check at the end of that is that now they do realize they've got an agreement with you and they realize what that agreement is. If we say, do you realize we had an agreement? And they go, yes. Do you realize that you broke that agreement? And they say, no. Then again, we've got to go through a kind of education process, or feedback process, as in how they actually violated that boundary. Taking responsibility for the communication ourselves, and then making sure that they realize what the agreement is and what they need to do to maintain it. If they say, yes, I realize we had an agreement, yes, I realize I broke that agreement, then you can say, okay, would you like to remake that agreement? If they say no, then I think we can pretty much say it's over and out. If they say yes, then you remake the agreement. What do you do then if they break the agreement again? Well, we go through the same process again. But I think a personal thing that you've got to think about is, how many times are you personally willing to remake an agreement with a person? If they keep violating your boundaries, really they're not willing to respect and honor your boundaries. If you allow people around you that aren't willing to respect and honor your boundaries, you're going to experience a lot of negative emotions all of the time. But equally, you'd really have to ask yourself the question, for what purpose would you want to have people around you that weren't willing to honor and respect your boundaries? So Uncle George Naopi is one of my mentors in Huna, and the chants here in Hawaii had a hula halau, a hula school. There's all girls in the school, and he had this particular rule as far as how many times people could break the rules and how many times people could violate his boundaries, if you like. So if one of the girls came to him and said, sorry, Kumu, I broke one of the rules. The first time the person did that, Uncle would just go, everybody screws up. Get over it. It's fine. If they then did the same thing again, then he would say, that's shame on you. If they did it a third time, he would say that that was shame on him because he allowed them to do it a third time. So the first time, get over it. Everybody makes a mistake. Forget it. Second time, shame on you. Third time, shame on me. And at the third time of shame on me, that was an over and out situation. It was a 3 strikes and you're out. So I think that's the important thing, is that for you to decide how many times you're willing to go through that maintenance of boundaries strategy. And you know, quite often when somebody tests the boundary in the first place, it's a totally unconscious thing. You know, I said about 5-year-olds. Well, you know, everybody's unconscious mind is like a 5, 6, or 7-year-old. So quite often when they just test the boundary, and it's just a small little test, then you say like, no, we already have an agreement on this. This is not the way things are going to be around here. Whether they've done presenting magically or not, they do a perfect distractor and they just go like, I was just checking. And that's the end of it. Quite often, if there's a small test and we don't do anything about it, the next test is a bigger test. And then the next test is a bigger test. Until, you know, quite often people have the experience that something massive comes out, it knocks them flat. But in actual fact, this thing had been building for quite some time. So there's some guidelines on boundaries, something a little bit different. It was something that we're talking about in the Huna intensive whilst we've been here this week. And it's something that I haven't spoken about in any other of my Facebook lives. So since I'm here in Hawaii, I thought I'd share that with you. I think it's an important life skill. It's something that we're not really taught. Most people aren't taught how to do. And what I find with my clients is that quite often, as I say, the reason why they experience their boundaries being run over is that they haven't really told anybody what their boundaries are. So I hope that's useful for you. Next week's Facebook Live Thursday at 1900 BST, because I think we're still going to be on summertime, I think. Next Thursday will be not at the beach, not at this glorious sunrise. It will be back in our West London offices and studio in Twickenham. But I look forward to seeing you there. Have a great morning if you're in this part of the world. A great day if you're in America, and a great evening if you're in Europe. And I look forward to seeing you next week.